In the summer of 2025, the architecture of global power is shifting on multiple fronts, and each tremor, from Washington to Southeast Asia to the forests of eastern Russia, is part of a deeper pattern, one that reveals the fraying seams of the post-Cold War order. From the heart of the United States, President Donald Trump is once again executing a strategy that leans heavily on disruption, legal disruption, fiscal disruption, and institutional realignment. On the surface, the day's headline seems scattered: a lawsuit against New York City, a reshuffling of federal agencies, a cancellation of foreign aid, a restructuring of homelessness policy. But these actions, when taken together, speak to a broader doctrine, one aimed at redefining the role of the federal government, realigning America's domestic and international commitments, and confronting perceived threats to national sovereignty, whether they originate in sanctuary cities or foreign capitals. In Brooklyn federal court, the Trump administration has filed a 37-page lawsuit against New York City and its mayor, Eric Adams. The legal action accuses the city of obstructing federal immigration enforcement, describing New York as a vanguard of interference against national immigration laws. This is not a new battle. For years, the Trump administration has been at odds with progressive strongholds over sanctuary city policies, but the timing of this legal escalation is strategic. It coincides with rising public concern over illegal immigration, with growing pressure from conservative lawmakers, and with an administration seeking to reassert federal authority over municipalities that challenge its immigration agenda. The message is clear, and it is designed to resonate far beyond New York. It is a signal to local leaders nationwide, a warning that federal supremacy in immigration matters will be enforced through every available legal mechanism. In practice, this lawsuit also serves a political function, allowing President Trump to sharpen the ideological contrast between his administration and urban Democratic leadership, casting himself once more as the defender of law and order amid what he describes as chaos and lawlessness. But immigration is only one front in this evolving domestic realignment. That same day, President Trump signed an executive order that fundamentally alters how cities and states can manage homelessness. The order makes it easier for local authorities to remove unhoused individuals from public spaces, a move framed by the administration as a matter of public safety, sanitation, and economic recovery. Critics have already raised alarms over human rights implications, but the order fits squarely within the Trumpian paradigm. Assert federal support for local crackdowns, bypass bureaucratic constraints, and restore what his administration calls civil norms in American cities. Simultaneously, President Trump finalized legislation that cancels $9 billion in foreign aid and funding for public broadcasting, including support for entities such as the Public Broadcasting Service. This is not a symbolic cut. It is a seismic rollback of soft power spending, one that echoes Trump's long-standing criticisms of international assistance and media funding as wasteful, ideologically biased, or misaligned with core national interests. What does this signal to the world? That the United States, under Trump's leadership, is prioritizing domestic recalibration over external generosity. That foreign aid, once a tool of diplomatic leverage and humanitarian projection, is now being reevaluated through the lens of transactional realism. Allies may interpret this as abandonment, adversaries may interpret it as weakness, but from the Trump administration's perspective, it is a return to strategic clarity, focusing on core domestic imperatives rather than diffuse global obligations. The bureaucratic machinery of the federal government is also being reshaped in real time. Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins has unveiled a plan to decentralize her department, relocating an estimated 2,600 staff members from Washington, D.C. to 5 regional hubs across the United States. The rationale? Efficiency, cost savings, and proximity to the agricultural communities they serve. But federal unions are already sounding the alarm, describing the move as a thinly veiled effort to weaken institutional cohesion, drive resignations, and further consolidate control at the executive level. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, a bipartisan group of lawmakers has introduced a bill that would make the head of the Federal Emergency Management Agency report directly to the President rather than to the Secretary of Homeland Security. This may seem procedural, but the implications are profound. It represents a centralization of crisis management authority at the White House, at a moment when President Trump is openly considering dismantling FEMA altogether. That consideration, more than theoretical, suggests a dramatic overhaul of how the United States prepares for and responds to disasters, natural or otherwise. In aggregate, these domestic maneuvers form a clear pattern. The Trump administration is not merely governing, it is restructuring. Each lawsuit, each executive order, each agency reform reflects a deeper ideological project, one that seeks to undo the institutional layers of post-September 11th governance, to disempower bureaucracies perceived as entrenched or resistant, and to reaffirm direct executive authority as the primary engine of policy. But as the United States turns inward, its retreat from certain global commitments is creating a vacuum, one that is already being tested. Thousands of miles away, in the contested borderlands of Southeast Asia, a different kind of rupture has emerged. The border between Thailand and Cambodia, along a fault line of unresolved history, has erupted once again in deadly violence. At least 12 people have been killed, most of them civilians, in what Thai officials describe as a Cambodian provocation near an ancient temple site. The details are still emerging. Cambodian officials claim they were acting in defense of national territory, while Thai fighter jets launched airstrikes against alleged Cambodian targets. The images are stark: villagers fleeing burning gas stations, the border reverberating with artillery fire, the weight of past grievances reactivated in a new cycle of escalation. This is not a one-off skirmish. It is part of a broader pattern of regional volatility that has intensified in the wake of reduced Western diplomatic engagement. With Washington distracted by internal reordering, and with Beijing focusing on maritime expansion, traditional mechanisms for mediation and deterrence have grown quieter. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations remains paralyzed by internal divisions, and neither the United Nations nor major powers have stepped decisively into the breach. The Thai-Cambodian clashes, though ostensibly local, carry ripple effects far beyond the Mekong Basin. They test the viability of regional security frameworks. They raise the specter of historical revisionism. And they offer China and the United States a new stage upon which to project influence or to reveal absence. And elsewhere, in the forests of the Russian Far East, another kind of failure has taken shape. A Soviet-era passenger plane operated by a private Siberian airline has crashed in the Amur region, killing all 48 people aboard. The images are haunting. Smoke rising from dense woodland, wreckage strewn across remote terrain, no survivors. Investigators are probing the cause, but the underlying reality is increasingly unavoidable. Russia's aviation infrastructure is unraveling. Sanctions imposed by the West in response to the Ukraine war have choked the supply of aircraft parts, restricted maintenance operations, and crippled fleet renewal plans. As a result, Russia's skies are being filled with aging aircraft, maintained under duress, operated under uncertainty. Each crash is not just a tragedy, it is a symptom of a system under unsustainable strain. This, too, is part of the global equation. As Russia sinks deeper into autarky, as the United States redraws its domestic lines, and as regions like Southeast Asia erupt with legacy conflicts, the international system that once managed great power competition and regional flare-ups is being stretched thin. In Ukraine, the battlefield continues to evolve, but the human cost remains unrelenting. The eastern Donetsk region, already scarred by years of entrenched conflict, has once again been struck by Russian artillery and drone assaults. 2 women were killed, more than a dozen civilians injured, in the latest iteration of a war that no longer follows front lines, but instead targets morale, infrastructure, and social cohesion. In Kharkiv, glide bombs have rained down on urban centers, injuring at least 33 civilians. And in Odessa, a port city long viewed as strategically vital for both commerce and defense, Russian drones have pierced residential buildings, reducing concrete to ruin and lives to statistics. The methods of warfare here are not new, but their normalization is alarming. Precision is replaced with area saturation. Civilian life is deemed expendable, and each escalation serves a dual purpose, not only military but psychological. The Kremlin understands that exhaustion can be weaponized. By sustaining a campaign of irregular, scattered, but relentless attacks, Moscow ensures that Ukraine's population never finds reprieve, and that the international community's attention is stretched, thinned, and eventually numbed. And yet, Ukraine persists, aided by Western support that remains essential, though increasingly conditional. But what happens when that support is scaled back? What happens when the world's largest economy begins re-evaluating the cost of foreign entanglements, not from a position of weakness, but as a deliberate policy shift? President Trump's cancellation of $9 billion in foreign aid is not a fiscal footnote. It is a pivot point. It marks a transition from liberal internationalism to transactional nationalism, from open-ended commitments to selective engagements. For Ukraine, and for other nations dependent on American security guarantees or humanitarian assistance, this signals a potential recalibration of expectations. Aid may continue, but it will do so under new terms, more restrictive, more scrutinized, and more aligned with immediate American interests. The vacuum this creates in places like Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa invites alternative patrons. China, with its Belt and Road architecture, Russia, with its energy leverage and paramilitary proxies, even regional actors like Turkey and Iran, who see opportunity in retreat. The rules-based order, long centered around Washington, is not being dismantled, but it is being decentralized. And in that decentralization, uncertainty becomes the new constant. Yet even amid global volatility, domestic markets continue their oscillation. On Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by more than 300 points, rattled not by war or legislation, but by words. Tesla CEO Elon Musk, a figure who straddles the line between technocrat and showman, issued a warning about turbulent times ahead. No specific trigger, no detailed forecast, just enough language to ignite investor anxiety. The Nasdaq responded with minor gains. The S&P 500 continued its record streak, but the message beneath the numbers was unmistakable. Confidence is brittle. In 2025, markets are not solely driven by fundamentals, they are driven by narratives. And those narratives, whether about supply chains, innovation, artificial intelligence, or energy transition, are shaped as much by perception as by performance. In this environment, a single comment from a tech magnate can ripple across global portfolios faster than any policy memo. This fragility, this responsiveness to sentiment over substance, mirrors the broader condition of the international system. Power remains centralized, but legitimacy is diffuse. Institutions persist, but their authority is contested. And as the world's military, political, and economic centers fracture into spheres of influence, culture and symbolism emerge as critical instruments of cohesion or division. Which brings us, paradoxically, to a figure not often analyzed in strategic briefings, but whose life and death underscore deeper themes of identity, nostalgia, and the weaponization of cultural icons. Hulk Hogan is dead. Born Terry Bollea, Hogan was not merely a wrestler. He was, for a time, the personification of a certain American archetype larger than life, triumphalist and uncompromising. In the 80s and 90s, he dominated the World Wrestling Federation, later renamed, capturing championship titles, television ratings, and the imagination of a nation that still believed in spectacle as truth. His was the American dream rendered in muscle and microphone. But Hogan's career was also marked by controversy. including a temporary expulsion from the Wrestling Hall of Fame following the public release of racist remarks. Redemption, however, came through litigation and political rebranding. In 2016, he won over $100 million in a privacy case against Gawker Media, a verdict that symbolized the growing backlash against digital surveillance, tabloid journalism, and the erosion of personal autonomy in the Internet age. More recently, Hogan made a dramatic return to the public stage, this time not in a wrestling ring, but at the Republican National Convention, flanked by chants and lights, endorsing Donald Trump before a live audience and millions of viewers. For many observers, it was a surreal image, but for the Trump campaign, it was strategic. Hogan embodied a specific kind of voter nostalgic, nationalist, and disenchanted with institutional elites. By aligning himself with such figures, President Trump did not merely seek celebrity endorsement, he tapped into an emotional reservoir of cultural grievance. In this theater of politics, symbolism is operational. Identity becomes a weapon, and memory, a battlefield. Hogan's death, reportedly from cardiac arrest, occurred at his Florida home. He was 71 years old. And while the passing of a public figure may not alter strategic calculations, it does shape the cultural terrain upon which those calculations are made. Power is not exercised in a vacuum. It is filtered through narratives, myths, and the collective perception of who embodies a nation's spirit and who does not. Meanwhile, in another corner of the cultural and intellectual arena, jazz icon Chuck Mangione has also passed away at the age of 84. Best known for his 1977 classic Feels So Good, Mangione's music provided a softer counterpoint to the harder edges of American life, a melodic thread that ran through decades of social change, political upheaval, and generational reinvention. His contribution may seem peripheral to statecraft, but it is not. Cultural exports from jazz to cinema to fashion have long been America's most potent soft power instruments. They reach places that diplomacy cannot time. They shape images that policy cannot control. And they endure beyond the lifespan of any administration. The decline or transformation of these cultural figures marks not only the end of individual lives, but the closing of chapters in America's soft power story. Together, the deaths of Hogan and Mangione bookend a peculiar dichotomy between brash populism and introspective artistry, between dominance and grace. In a world increasingly defined by polarization and spectacle, both paths reflect aspects of the American experience that still project outward, shaping how the United States is perceived, emulated, or rejected abroad. But death, like policy, also creates space. And into that space rushes new momentum, legal, military, technological. It is in this dynamic environment that the next phase of 2025's geopolitical recalibration is unfolding. As U.S. cities face litigation from their own federal government, as foreign aid vanishes, as planes fall from the sky, and borders ignite, a new architecture of global friction is taking shape. And it is in this friction between old institutions and emergent strategies, between memory and ambition, between symbolism and force, that the next conflicts will either be managed or allowed to spiral. To understand the direction of the United States in 2025, one must examine not just the proclamations of its leadership, but the restructuring of its internal machinery. At the heart of this transformation is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, an institution created to coordinate national responses to crises ranging from hurricanes to terrorist attacks. It was born out of the Cold War's logic of centralized continuity, the idea that, in the face of catastrophe, only a strong federal core could ensure order and recovery. For decades, it has been a key node in America's resilience infrastructure. But today, it is being redefined. A new bipartisan bill introduced in the House of Representatives proposes a radical shift, making the head of FEMA report directly to the president, bypassing the Secretary of Homeland Security. The change may appear administrative, but it is doctrinal. It eliminates an institutional buffer, collapses the chain of command, and brings the machinery of emergency response directly under executive control. For President Donald Trump, this is not merely a management decision. It is the continuation of a philosophy, one that treats federal agencies not as autonomous actors, but as instruments to be centralized, redirected, or dismantled according to immediate strategic objectives. Indeed, the president has openly stated that he would like to shut down FEMA altogether. That statement, though not yet executed, has already sent waves through the national security establishment. Such a move would not be unprecedented, but it would be transformative. Dismantling FEMA would represent the deconstruction of a key pillar in America's post-September 11th emergency governance framework. It would eliminate the default agency for disaster relief and transfer that responsibility, whether explicitly or by vacuum, to states, the military, or newly created federal constructs yet to be defined. The implications of such a maneuver are vast. Domestically, it would expose cities and states to heightened vulnerabilities, particularly those with fewer resources or weaker infrastructure. Internationally, it would send a signal that the United States is reorienting inward, prioritizing sovereignty and executive discretion over collective federal resilience. It also suggests that future crises, whether natural disasters, pandemics, or cyber attacks, may be met with less institutional consistency and more improvisational, politically determined responses. Allies will read this as a warning that contingency planning involving the United States must now account for institutional volatility. Adversaries, meanwhile, may interpret it as an opening, a chance to exploit moments of internal American disorganization or to amplify domestic tensions that FEMA once helped contain. This is not speculative paranoia. It is strategic reality. Disaster response is not merely humanitarian. It is a form of national deterrence. A country that can recover rapidly from shock communicates strength. A country that cannot invites pressure. In 2025, that distinction may prove more consequential than ever. These shifts, taken together, form the scaffolding of a new American statecraft, not the soft power liberalism of the 1990s, nor the security-centric multilateralism of the early 2000s, but something else entirely: a streamlined, domestically focused, executive-driven apparatus built less on alliance maintenance and more on national coherence. It is against this backdrop that international actors are recalibrating their own positions. In Europe, traditional American partners are increasingly questioning the durability of U.S. security guarantees. With the suspension of foreign aid, the potential dismantling of FEMA, and the legal confrontation with major U.S. cities, European capitals are bracing for reduced coordination, particularly in areas such as refugee management, counterterrorism, and transatlantic crisis logistics. This realignment is not ideological, it is operational. If Washington begins to outsource its domestic emergencies to local governments or new structures, then why would it continue to lead global emergency efforts abroad? And if FEMA no longer exists as a planning partner, what does that mean for NATO joint exercises, multilateral drills, or coordinated disaster relief missions? The vacuum will not remain unfilled. China has already expanded its emergency diplomacy toolkit, sending rapid response teams to Africa, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Eastern Europe. While not yet matching American capacity, the symbolic effect is clear. Beijing offers a model of centralized technocratic control, coupled with swift mobilization. In a world where logistics define legitimacy, that model has appeal. Russia, by contrast, continues to degrade its own capabilities through attrition. The recent plane crash in the Amur region, killing 48 people aboard a Soviet-era aircraft, is not merely an aviation accident. It is a strategic data point, revealing the cumulative impact of isolation, sanctions, and technological stagnation. Western sanctions have deprived Russia of critical aircraft components, maintenance software, and fleet modernization support. What remains is an aging infrastructure, held together by improvisation and desperation. Each crash, each failed launch, each grounded fleet represents a shrinking radius of Russian projection capability. No longer able to rely on safe domestic aviation, Moscow faces logistical hurdles, not just for civilian transport, but for troop movement, supply chain flexibility, and regional deterrence. The degradation of aviation, like the degradation of information integrity or institutional independence, is a slow bleed. It does not grab headlines until it does. And in that moment, what was once treated as a domestic concern becomes a geopolitical liability. The implications for China are nuanced. Beijing watches Russia's decline with a mix of concern and opportunity. A weakened Russia makes China the default Eurasian power, but it also means inheriting the burden of regional stability, something Beijing has long sought to avoid, in favor of selective influence. As Russia falters in aviation, diplomacy, and wartime sustainability, China is forced to consider whether it must play a larger stabilizing role in Central Asia and beyond, a prospect that carries significant cost. The United States, meanwhile, faces its own paradox. By withdrawing aid, centralizing power, and signaling institutional withdrawal, it is reducing its operational visibility abroad. And yet, its strategic gravity remains. American decisions, whether legal, bureaucratic, or symbolic, still echo across continents. Cities like New York being sued by their own federal government, FEMA being stripped of its independence, foreign aid being zeroed out, these are not internal matters. They are international signals, and they are being read accordingly. In this sense, the Cold War architecture of visibility and control is no longer applicable. We now live in a system where disruption is deliberate, ambiguity is tactical, and centralization is the currency of power. What emerges from this flux will not resemble the world of the late 20th century, nor even the war on terror era of the early 21st. It will be something else, something still undefined, but increasingly shaped by legal maneuvers, cultural symbols, and institutional rearrangements occurring in real time. And in this new arena, the line between domestic governance and international posture is not only blurred, it is vanishing. The renewed eruption of violence along the Thai-Cambodian border is not merely a regional flare-up, it is a test case for the emerging world order, one in which historical tensions are no longer contained by multinational institutions, and in which local actors increasingly pursue unilateral strategies when diplomacy fails. 12 civilians are dead, more than that wounded, and the ground situation remains fluid. Thai officials assert that the conflict began near an ancient temple, a historically sensitive site that has triggered clashes before. But the pace and intensity of this confrontation mark a departure from previous disputes. Thai airstrikes on Cambodian targets, Cambodian shelling of Thai villages. The conflict has leapt beyond warning shots into open military engagement. For decades, the 500-mile border between the two countries has been an uneasy seam, drawn by colonial cartography, contested by nationalist politics, and stabilized when necessary by regional forums. But today, the mechanisms of restraint are failing. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, long praised for its consensus-based diplomacy, is silent. Its charter offers no enforceable mechanism for intervention. Its member states, preoccupied with their own strategic calculations, are unwilling to jeopardize bilateral relationships, and its capacity for collective action is paralyzed by an unspoken hierarchy, one in which larger states assert primacy and smaller states defer, even in moments of crisis. This institutional inertia has consequences. When conflict erupts between ASEAN members and the bloc fails to respond, it not only undermines its own credibility, it invites extra-regional actors to fill the vacuum. Already, signals have emerged that both Beijing and Washington are closely monitoring the situation. For China, Cambodia has long been a client state. Through infrastructure loans, military aid, and diplomatic backing, Beijing has built deep influence in Phnom Penh. In return, Cambodia has often acted as China's proxy within ASEAN blocking resolutions, critical of Beijing's South China Sea policy, and enabling a divide-and-conquer strategy that weakens ASEAN coherence. But in this conflict, China's posture has been more cautious. Despite its ties to Cambodia, Beijing has not yet issued a strong public statement of support, nor has it condemned Thailand's actions. This ambiguity is calculated. China understands that open alignment with Cambodia in a dispute that involves civilian casualties and border incursions would risk further alienating Thailand, a country Beijing has courted for its strategic position and economic potential. Instead, Beijing is likely to pursue dual-track diplomacy, offering behind-the-scenes support to Cambodia while avoiding overt involvement and simultaneously deepening engagement with Thai military and political elites to ensure continued access and influence. This is not neutrality, it is hedging, and it reflects a broader Chinese strategy, one that avoids direct entanglement but seeks to shape outcomes through leverage, inducement, and presence. The United States, for its part, has taken a different approach. Under President Donald Trump, U.S. foreign policy has become more selective, less focused on maintaining regional balances for their own sake, and more attuned to the transactional value of engagement. In this case, that means publicly supporting de-escalation, but privately weighing whether the conflict could serve broader U.S. objectives. A drawn-out clash between Thailand and Cambodia could undermine Chinese cohesion strategies in Southeast Asia, disrupt Beijing's Belt and Road logistics that run through the region, and push both parties to reconsider their reliance on Chinese diplomacy. It could also offer the U.S. an opportunity to reassert its role as an arbiter, not through traditional multilateral channels, but through targeted military cooperation, intelligence sharing, and back-channel negotiations, particularly with Bangkok. But this window is narrow. Should the conflict escalate further, drawing in civilians, displacing populations, or prompting retaliatory strikes beyond the immediate border, the situation could spiral beyond control. At that point, no amount of calculated ambiguity or selective engagement will suffice. Regional conflict, once ignited, has a tendency to evolve according to its own logic. This is the core dilemma facing both major powers. They must decide whether to treat this conflict as a localized dispute, a manageable proxy clash, or a potential flashpoint with wider strategic ramifications. And in that decision lies a broader truth about the current geopolitical moment. The institutions that once anchored regional stability are now reactive at best and absent at worst. ASEAN is fragmented. The United Nations is overextended. Western alliances are internally preoccupied. What remains are bilateral deals, informal alignments, and improvisational diplomacy. In this environment, legacy conflicts reemerge, not because they were forgotten, but because the scaffolding that once kept them dormant has eroded. Thailand and Cambodia are not the only test case. Around the world, in the Caucasus, the Sahel, the Taiwan Strait, and the Balkans, frozen disputes are thawing. Lines once redrawn in peace are being challenged in war, and the logic of national sovereignty, long held sacred, is being reinterpreted through lenses of cultural entitlement, historical grievance, and strategic utility. For policymakers in Washington, Beijing, Moscow, and Brussels, the lesson is unambiguous. Do not assume that regional crises will remain regional. Do not assume that historical settlements will hold without maintenance. Do not assume that institutions, once paralyzed, can spontaneously reactivate when crisis strikes. In Southeast Asia, the smoke rising from a gas station in rural Thailand is not just evidence of Cambodian rocket fire. It is a symbol of the world's transition away from global consensus and toward contested legitimacy. It is a reminder that even ancient temples, once protected by international treaties and cultural conventions, can become battlegrounds once more. And it is a warning that the old equilibrium forged in the post-Cold War glow of integration and interdependence is giving way to a new era, one defined not by order, but by friction. As the international system fractures outward, the United States continues to consolidate inward, not only through institutional restructuring, but through symbolic realignment, a recalibration of what it means to be American, who belongs in that category, and what behaviors or affiliations now fall outside its boundaries. This realignment is not merely rhetorical. It is codified in legal actions, embedded in executive orders, and staged on platforms where entertainment and politics merge, creating a new national mythology in real time. When President Donald Trump sues the mayor of New York City over sanctuary policies, he is not simply pursuing federal supremacy. He is issuing a challenge to a particular vision of American identity, one in which local jurisdictions defy immigration enforcement in the name of humanitarian values or historical precedent. That model is now being treated as adversarial. In this framework, America First is not a slogan. It is a legal posture. Sanctuary cities are no longer just political irritants. They are rebranded as threats to federal integrity. The lawsuit is therefore strategic not only in its timing, but in its narrative design. It allows the administration to position itself as a guardian of national sovereignty and to depict urban progressivism as a destabilizing force. This is lawfare as cultural warfare, and the battleground is the American mind. The same logic animates the executive order targeting homelessness. To many observers, the order appears to empower cities and states, but its deeper function is centralizing, giving local governments broad discretion to remove unhoused populations while shielding them from legal blowback and public accountability. The objective is not simply cleanup, it is visibility control, to render social disorder invisible, to reassert aesthetic control over urban landscapes, and to redefine who is permitted to occupy public space. It is a return to the politics of respectability, enforced not through moral persuasion, but through procedural authority. In the broader geopolitical context, this matters. The image a state projects domestically is inseparable from how it is perceived abroad. If America is seen to criminalize poverty, dismantle humanitarian outreach, and escalate legal actions against its own cities, then its claims to moral leadership on the world stage become less persuasive, particularly in global forums focused on rights, equity, and governance. Yet this apparent contradiction is not seen as a weakness by the Trump administration. On the contrary, it is understood as strategic clarity. In this worldview, soft power is no longer a priority, nor even a currency. Legitimacy derives from coherence, from the ability to project internal unity and external decisiveness, even at the cost of perception. Allies may be unsettled, rivals may be emboldened, but the domestic political base, the audience that ultimately sustains executive power, is reaffirmed. And within that base, certain symbols carry disproportionate weight. The re-emergence of figures like Hulk Hogan into political spaces exemplifies this phenomenon. When the former wrestling icon took the stage at the Republican National Convention in support of President Trump, it was not about policy expertise or electoral calculus. It was about cultural identification. Hogan represented a specific mythology of American dominance, individual triumph, and moral certainty. His controversies, his legal battles, his fall and resurgence, all mirrored the Trumpian narrative of persecution and vindication. In this context, celebrity endorsement is not a sideshow. It is a mechanism of national storytelling, one that fuses entertainment with identity and converts nostalgia into loyalty. This strategy is mirrored in the administration's treatment of national institutions. Where past presidents defended the bureaucratic state as a necessary apparatus, President Trump treats it as a source of obstruction. Agencies like FEMA are not reformed quietly. They are challenged publicly. Legal battles are not delegated to backrooms. They are fought in headlines. This approach creates friction, but it also creates alignment, forcing institutions to declare allegiance or face marginalization. That polarization is not accidental. It is the intended terrain upon which the administration operates best. In a polarized environment, ambiguity becomes weakness, compromise becomes betrayal, and every decision becomes a referendum on belonging. This logic collapses nuance, but it also simplifies governance. It enables executive action to be framed as rescue and opposition to be reframed as sabotage. The cultural impact of this dynamic is significant. Public trust in institutions from media to law enforcement to academia has been steadily eroding. But in 2025, the erosion has reached a critical threshold. Many Americans no longer view these entities as neutral. They see them as politicized, weaponized, or captured by adversarial interests. This perception is not entirely manufactured. In some cases, it reflects real failures, real biases, and real gaps in accountability. But in this moment, those realities are being restructured into a narrative of existential struggle, one in which the president positions himself as the sole guarantor of truth, order, and national survival. Internationally, this posture has consequences. Allies accustomed to coordination through institutions now find themselves dealing directly with individuals and navigating a landscape in which policy may shift not through process, but through proclamation. Adversaries, meanwhile, see opportunity to exploit divisions, delay consensus, and probe the thresholds of American response. When FEMA is weakened, when federal courts are used to settle ideological disputes, when cultural symbols are weaponized, the United States projects a mixed signal, one of internal confidence and structural fragility. That duality is what defines this phase of American power. It is neither ascendant nor collapsing. It is not returning to a previous norm, nor embracing a coherent new model. It is navigating transition, volatile, experimental, and deliberately ambiguous. In that ambiguity, the most important battles are not fought with weapons, but with stories. And in the story that is now unfolding, the protagonist is not a nation-state, nor an institution, nor even an idea. It is a personality wielding the levers of statecraft like a branding campaign, redefining what is real through repetition, confrontation, and sheer volume. This is not governance in the traditional sense. It is narrative control at scale. And in a world increasingly defined by perception, virality, and polarization, that control may be more powerful than policy. As the United States redefines its identity through legal confrontation, institutional transformation, and cultural narrative, the global reaction is beginning to crystallize. Allies are watching closely not out of admiration, but out of necessity. From Brussels to Berlin, from Seoul to Canberra, traditional partners are recalibrating their assumptions. The era in which American leadership was synonymous with predictability, consensus, and multilateralism has passed. What replaces it is not yet fully formed, but the outlines are visible. It is a model rooted in executive discretion, not alliance frameworks. It privileges strategic autonomy over global stewardship, and it embraces transactional diplomacy over ideological alignment. Europe has responded with a mixture of caution and acceleration. In Paris and Berlin, there is growing momentum behind a long-discussed but rarely implemented ambition: European strategic sovereignty. The concept, once abstract, now carries operational urgency. Leaders recognize that American security guarantees, while still present, are now conditioned by political volatility. The withdrawal of foreign aid, the threats to NATO cohesion, the weakening of multilateral commitments. These are not temporary disruptions. They are signals of a structural shift. As a result, European defense budgets are rising, intelligence cooperation is being restructured, and industrial policies are aligning around defense autonomy. The European Union, once a commercial bloc first and a political bloc second, is evolving into a security actor, not by choice, but by default. This transformation is not seamless. Internal divisions persist. Eastern member states remain skeptical of French-German dominance. Southern states remain preoccupied with economic instability. And the bloc as a whole lacks a coherent command architecture. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Europe is preparing for a future in which the United States is less predictable, and potentially less engaged. In the Indo-Pacific, the signals are even more acute. China sees the fragmentation of Western consensus as opportunity, but it also sees danger. The conflict between Thailand and Cambodia has placed Beijing in a strategic bind. On one hand, it has long cultivated deep ties with Cambodia, providing military assistance, infrastructure loans, and political backing. On the other hand, it seeks to maintain and deepen relations with Thailand, a key node in regional logistics, trade, and transshipment. The border clashes now force China to walk a tightrope. If it sides too openly with Phnom Penh, it risks alienating Bangkok and triggering a wider regional backlash. If it remains too detached, it undermines its image as a reliable patron. Thus, Beijing's response has been one of strategic ambiguity, offering quiet support while publicly calling for restraint. This dual posture reflects a broader Chinese doctrine: avoid entanglement, preserve influence, and let others exhaust themselves. But this doctrine has limits. As regional disputes multiply, and as American engagement becomes more selective, Beijing will be pressed to do more than offer slogans and loans. It will be asked to guarantee outcomes, to take sides, to absorb risk, and that is a departure from its traditional preference for managed ambiguity. Russia, by contrast, is already past that threshold. Its war in Ukraine has forced a choice between global legitimacy and battlefield escalation, and it has chosen the latter. The cost has been immense: international sanctions, strategic isolation, and now systemic decay. The recent crash of a Soviet-era passenger jet in the Amur region is not just a transportation tragedy. It is a window into Russian decline. The aircraft, operated by a private Siberian airline, went down in dense forest near the Chinese border. All 48 people aboard perished. Investigators are examining the cause, but the broader context is inescapable. International sanctions have choked Russia's aviation sector. Spare parts are scarce, maintenance protocols are improvised, oversight is minimal. The result is a slow-motion collapse of basic infrastructure, with implications that go beyond a domestic inconvenience. Military readiness is affected. Supply chain resilience is affected. Diplomatic reach, particularly in Central Asia and the Arctic, is affected. In a geopolitical environment where mobility is power, Russia is losing altitude. This reality is not lost on Moscow's allies and adversaries. For Beijing, Russia's vulnerability poses a dilemma. A weakened Russia creates more space for Chinese expansion in Central Asia and the Arctic, but it also increases the risk of instability spilling across borders. For the West, it presents both a tactical advantage and a strategic concern. On one hand, Russia's declining capability limits its aggression. On the other hand, desperation breeds unpredictability. An isolated, humiliated Russia, backed into a corner, may resort to riskier behavior: cyber offensives, energy weaponization, or covert sabotage. And then there is the global South. In Latin America, Africa, and parts of South Asia, the recalibration of great power relationships is opening new avenues. Countries once dependent on American aid are seeking new patrons. Chinese infrastructure programs, Russian arms deals, Gulf capital flows, Indian technology partnerships. These are not replacing the United States, but they are fragmenting its hegemony. No single power is emerging as a replacement, but a constellation of alternatives is forming. This multipolarity is not ideologically coherent nor institutionally anchored. It is transactional, competitive, and inherently unstable. And in that instability, the traditional tools of diplomacy, carrots and sticks, leverage and pressure, become less effective. Influence now flows through speed, visibility, and presence. It is no longer enough to make commitments. One must demonstrate capacity, deliver outcomes, and adapt in real time. In this environment, symbolism and posture matter as much as treaties. A delayed aid shipment can cause more reputational damage than a broken alliance. A single military exercise or its absence can shift a region's strategic calculation. This is the new logic of global competition, one where chaos is not the enemy, but the terrain. one where alignment is not fixed, but negotiated anew with each crisis, one where the institutions of yesterday must compete with the improvisations of today. And in this evolving system, every move by the United States, whether legal, cultural, or military, becomes a signal, interpreted, amplified, and inevitably contested. As the United States redefines its identity through legal confrontation, institutional transformation, and cultural narrative, the global reaction is beginning to crystallize. Allies are watching closely, not out of admiration, but out of necessity. From Brussels to Berlin, from Seoul to Canberra, traditional partners are recalibrating their assumptions. The era in which American leadership was synonymous with predictability, consensus, and multilateralism has passed. What replaces it is not yet fully formed, but the outlines are visible. It is a model rooted in executive discretion, not alliance frameworks. It privileges strategic autonomy over global stewardship, and it embraces transactional diplomacy over ideological alignment. Europe has responded with a mixture of caution and acceleration. In Paris and Berlin, there is growing momentum behind a long-discussed but rarely implemented ambition: European strategic sovereignty. The concept, once abstract now, carries operational urgency. Leaders recognize that American security guarantees, while still present, are now conditioned by political volatility. The withdrawal of foreign aid, the threats to NATO cohesion, the weakening of multilateral commitments, these are not temporary disruptions. They are signals of a structural shift. As a result, European defense budgets are rising. Intelligence cooperation is being restructured, and industrial policies are aligning around defense autonomy. The European Union, once a commercial bloc first and a political bloc second, is evolving into a security actor not by choice, but by default. This transformation is not seamless. Internal divisions persist. Eastern member states remain skeptical of French-German dominance. Southern states remain preoccupied with economic instability. And the bloc as a whole lacks a coherent command architecture. But the trajectory is unmistakable. Europe is preparing for a future in which the United States is less predictable and potentially less engaged. In the Indo-Pacific, the signals are even more acute. China sees the fragmentation of Western consensus as opportunity, but it also sees danger. The conflict between Thailand and Cambodia has placed Beijing in a strategic bind. On one hand, it has long cultivated deep ties with Cambodia, providing military assistance, infrastructure loans, and political backing. On the other hand, it seeks to maintain and deepen relations with Thailand, a key node in regional logistics, trade, and transshipment. The border clashes now force China to walk a tightrope. If it sides too openly with Phnom Penh, it risks alienating Bangkok and triggering a wider regional backlash. If it remains too detached, it undermines its image as a reliable patron. Thus, Beijing's response has been one of strategic ambiguity, offering quiet support while publicly calling for restraint. This dual posture reflects a broader Chinese doctrine: avoid entanglement, preserve influence, and let others exhaust themselves. But this doctrine has limits. As regional disputes multiply, and as American engagement becomes more selective, Beijing will be pressed to do more than offer slogans and loans. It will be asked to guarantee outcomes, to take sides, to absorb risk, and that is a departure from its traditional preference for managed ambiguity. Russia, by contrast, is already past that threshold. Its war in Ukraine has forced a choice between global legitimacy and battlefield escalation, and it has chosen the latter. The cost has been immense: international sanctions, strategic isolation, and now systemic decay. The recent crash of a Soviet-era passenger jet in the Amur region is not just a transportation tragedy. It is a window into Russian decline. The aircraft, operated by a private Siberian airline, went down in dense forest near the Chinese border. All 48 people aboard perished. Investigators are examining the cause, but the broader context is inescapable. International sanctions have choked Russia's aviation sector. Spare parts are scarce. Maintenance protocols are improvised. Oversight is minimal. The result is a slow-motion collapse of basic infrastructure, with implications that go beyond domestic inconvenience. Military readiness is affected. Supply chain resilience is affected. Diplomatic reach, particularly in Central Asia and the Arctic, is affected. In a geopolitical environment where mobility is power, Russia is losing altitude. This reality is not lost on Moscow's allies and adversaries. For Beijing, Russia's vulnerability poses a dilemma. A weakened Russia creates more space for Chinese expansion in Central Asia and the Arctic, but it also increases the risk of instability spilling across borders. For the West, it presents both a tactical advantage and a strategic concern. On one hand, Russia's declining capability limits its aggression. On the other hand, desperation breeds unpredictability. An isolated, humiliated Russia, backed into a corner, may resort to riskier behavior, cyber offensives, energy weaponization, or covert sabotage. And then there is the global South. In Latin America, Africa, and parts of South Asia, the recalibration of great power relationships is opening new avenues. Countries once dependent on American aid are seeking new patrons. Chinese infrastructure programs, Russian arms deals, Gulf capital flows, Indian technology partnerships. These are not replacing the United States, but they are fragmenting its hegemony. No single power is emerging as a replacement, but a constellation of alternatives is forming. This multipolarity is not ideologically coherent, nor institutionally anchored. It is transactional, competitive, and inherently unstable. And in that instability, the traditional tools of diplomacy, carrots and sticks, leverage and pressure, become less effective. Influence now flows through speed, visibility, and presence. It is no longer enough to make commitments. One must demonstrate capacity, deliver outcomes, and adapt in real time. In this environment, symbolism and posture matter as much as treaties. A delayed aid shipment can cause more reputational damage than a broken alliance. A single military exercise or its absence can shift a region's strategic calculation. This is the new logic of global competition. One where chaos is not the enemy, but the terrain. One where alignment is not fixed, but negotiated anew with each crisis. One where the institutions of yesterday must compete with the improvisations of today. And in this evolving system, every move by the United States, whether legal, cultural, or military, becomes a signal, interpreted, amplified, and inevitably contested. At the end of this chain of events, what emerges is not resolution, but pattern. A pattern defined by systemic friction. Domestic, legal, cultural, military, informational, none of these domains are isolated anymore. They intersect, they reinforce, they destabilize. In the United States, the president is suing its largest city, not over economics or crime, but over its defiance of federal immigration enforcement. This is not just a legal case, it is a national signal, a message that internal dissent will be treated not as pluralism, but as insubordination. At the same time, executive orders are reshaping who has the right to occupy public space and under what conditions. Homelessness is no longer a social issue, it is a jurisdictional test of executive reach. Cities must now choose comply with the federal directive or risk political and legal isolation. $9 billion in foreign aid has been canceled, including funds that once served as stabilizers for fragile regions. Public broadcasting budgets, long protected as cultural commons, have been zeroed out. These cuts are not fiscal efficiency. They are recalibrations of national identity, a rollback of soft power in favor of hardened posture. FEMA, once a cornerstone of domestic crisis response, is now on the edge of political dissolution. A bill in Congress would rewire its command structure. The president has openly mused about dismantling the agency altogether. This is not just administrative change, it is a philosophical break. The idea that emergencies require institutional expertise is being replaced by the idea that executive willpower alone is sufficient. Globally, planes fall in Russia's Far East as sanctions grind its infrastructure down. Borders erupt in Southeast Asia as Thailand and Cambodia revive ancient disputes. Drones strike apartment blocks in Ukraine. Glide bombs fall on Kharkiv. Port cities like Odessa shake with explosions not from armies, but from tactics designed to wear down civil society itself. In the markets, Elon Musk mutters a warning, and $300 billion in value vanishes in hours. Confidence in the financial system now hangs on fragments of speech, not fundamentals. The Dow declines, the S&P climbs, the Nasdaq stutters, all in response to moods, not metrics. And in the culture, America buries its contradictions. Chuck Mangione, the voice of serenity, melody, and understated excellence, dies at 84. His trumpet once played in White House galas and street-side cafes alike. He represented the America that reached the world not with might, but with beauty. That chapter has closed. Hulk Hogan the brawler, the brand, the firework-wrapped fantasy of dominance dies at 71. In his final public act, he did not enter the ring. He stood at a political convention, cheering for a president who used him not as nostalgia, but as confirmation. A symbol of the America that no longer apologizes because it no longer explains. Between these two deaths lies a national shift, from persuasion to performance, from shared ethos to contested myth, from system to signal. In the age now emerging, cold logic does not promise coherence. It does not promise stability. It does not promise peace. What it identifies is the return of friction as the baseline condition. Friction between cities and states, friction between allies and spheres, friction between expectation and capacity, and most dangerously, friction between power and legitimacy. The world is not entering a multipolar harmony. It is entering a multi-vector contest, one where identity is tactical, narrative is ammunition, and endurance, not consensus, becomes the defining asset. The legal war between the federal government and New York City is not just a domestic standoff. It is the first salvo in a new doctrine, assertive sovereignty over cooperative governance. The shutdown of FEMA is not just a dismantling of bureaucracy. It is a message to both allies and enemies. America will manage chaos its own way, or not at all. The airstrikes on Cambodia, the Russian glide bombs, the institutional collapse of aviation. Each of these is a fracture point, one more crack in the facade of international management. They do not lead to world war, nor to immediate collapse. But they do usher in something else. A phase of geopolitics where friction is permanent, where clarity is scarce, where the default setting is not peace, not conflict, but contest. And in that contest, cold logic endures, not by predicting outcomes, but by tracing intent, by mapping pressure, by identifying the signals within the noise. This is not the return of the Cold War. It is something colder, something less structured, but more volatile, and it has already begun.